Hey, let's read Crucial Conversations by Grinny et al. To improve our communication and collaboration, influence, ability to persuade, and ability to deliver. We're in chapter 5, Master My Stories. We already know from chapter 4 that stories are a useful tool because they allow us to, for instance, work backwards from what we would want to say in a behavioral interview in order to prepare our current meeting agenda. Chapter 5 is going to tell us that story models are useful for additional purposes. Namely, it can help us to objectively consider and control emotion in the conversation. And then also by crafting a story, we can compare it to story archetypes and understand whether the story we're telling is a typically effective story. So they give some examples of story archetypes that are better and worse. The first emotion we want to be sensitive to and engage is the emotion of wanting to have a discussion. So don't be the person who begrudgingly shows up to a conversation. If you believe a conversation would be constructive, choose the emotion of positivity and excitement. Choosing positive emotion is going to set the stage for a successful conversation. Let's reflect on the way we feel and notice that emotions don't just happen. Emotions are internally driven. So if you're mad, you make you mad. You need to take some personal ownership so that you can then take some personal correctives so that you can then position yourself and therefore the entire conversational party to a good state to optimize outcomes. Basically, reflect on negative emotions in general and try to eliminate them. So this is like a mindfulness meditation thing, like Bruce Lee, just be water. Try to just position yourself emotionally into a good state before entering into a conversation, particularly a crucial conversation, a high stakes conversation. Now we're creating our story. We thought about the things that they wanted and the things that we want, and we came up with objectives, but we're also going to now consider the feelings of a story. And we are going to try to tell a story in a way that not to create drama, not to create emotional sensation. We're not making like a Disney movie. We want to tell a story that evokes positive emotion. That's going to lead to amenability of all parties to accept the shared narrative and then ultimately accept the suggested actions and the shared outcome. So by generating positivity and excitement with our story, that's how we are adding an additional push, an additional nudge of getting others on board with us, basically. Now you might think, hey, like making a story is like a bad idea. The problem is that we can conceptualize any mental model as a story. So even if you don't realize it, you are telling yourself and you are telling others a story. There is an embedded narrative in your communication. So the smart thing to do is to own it and refine it. So here we're noticing that there are different ways to express our story. So we're going to be strategic about the way we express it. If we take control of our stories, they won't control us. And we don't need to accept the stories told by others. So if we can take the first step, if we can take a step in crafting our personal narrative, our personal brand, then we don't get labeled with a negative brand that others have put on us. Once a brand around you is developed by others in a company, it's really hard to get rid of that. Much smarter to build your own. And it's a general narrative, even outside of this book, that you should be creating a personal professional brand, right? So we're just building on that idea, and we're just realizing that your personal brand isn't only important at interview time. It's important in your day-to-day high-stakes communications, like your weekly meetings and whatnot. If you're having trouble crafting your story, a great starting point is reality. We're not trying to paint a fiction here. Our story should be a non-fiction story. So start with retracing what actually happened. Just notice what happened, what you did, how you feel, analyze it, what emotions did you create? And then you can basically like draft and edit your manuscript, right? You can retell it, keeping the true facts in place, but changing the wording in order to evoke different emotions. And you can notice that when you're telling yourself a story that makes yourself feel positive, hopefully that's going to make other people feel positive too. It's definitely possible to craft a story that makes you feel bad at the expense of others. Don't tell that story. Pick a story that yields shared positive emotion. At least you think it will. So this is a matter of like emotional debugging, basically. Page 88 reminds us get back to the facts. So again, the story that we're telling is a nonfiction story. We're being careful about our wording. We're creating an engaging goal that we're all striving to, but it's based in reality. When we build a data-driven, fact-based, research-based narrative, it becomes much easier for other parties to accept and get on board with. Not only does adding facts make it easier to persuade people, but independent of the persuasion, independent of the social acceptability of your story, the fact that your story becomes based on data and research independently makes it a more effective approach to get to whatever solution you're trying to get to. And you can also use the behavioral interview mental model here. What would you say in your behavioral interview? You might use the STAR method or the SOAR method. You would have measurable outcomes, right? You can take that same mental model to have measurable inputs to your story. Avoid weasel words and ambiguity. Okay, so there's a few archetypal stories that we want to avoid. Now that we've crafted our story, we want to avoid victim stories. You may well be a victim. To avoid a victim story doesn't mean that the victim story is invalid. It just means it's not a good story. So let's say that you and Jim are having an argument and you are right and Jim is bullying you. Well, okay, that's terrible. Jim is bad, but how are you going to deliver the project? Crafting a story that says Jim is bad is not a way forward. As emotionally painful to you as it might be, crafting a story where you and Jim end up working together and you both look good is the way forward. So I'm sorry that Jim stinks, but maybe he can end up changing from the bad guy to the good guy. And that would be a great story. Also, avoid villain stories. So just like it's not my fault, it's all your fault. Let's think about Jim again. I don't know anybody named Jim. I'm sure I do, but this is not about any particular Jim. Even if Jim is not on the delivery team, even if Jim is in another org or another company, think about your interviews. If you go interview for a new company and you're complaining about your previous employer, do you see how that's a negative signal? So we want to tell hero stories. Hero stories are inspiring and positive, and heroes can overcome problems, but we don't want to tell villain stories. So make your villain not a human. Make your villain the problem itself, and your heroes are people, and then the problems are just things that got in the way that you were able to overcome. That's a good story. In a professional setting. I'm not trying to give you tips on making like a movie. And the there's nothing else I can do story, which is similar to the I'm a victim story. In your stories, you want to list things that you tried, okay? And a rule of 3 here is pretty good. So let's say that you're a junior and you're escalating a problem to your senior. Don't tell your senior, there's nothing I can do. Tell your senior, here are the 3 things I tried and here was the result. And, I'm under pressure for a time box. And so at this point, that's the reason I'm escalating to you. That's a good story. And it sets you up to look good because let's say that you're the junior, you go to the senior and you say, hey, there's nothing I can do. And then the senior solves the problem and says, look what I just did. You could have done that. So by saying, here's what I did, it didn't work, can you help me? That frame ends up making you look better because now the senior can say, hey, look, next time you could do this. So they didn't actually prove you wrong. They didn't actually disagree with you. Whereas if you said there's nothing I could do and they said, yeah, there is something that you could do, they basically called you wrong, right? So that makes you look bad. It's like a skill issue. You also don't want to provide a story where you just didn't try at all. You were assigned a problem and you immediately escalated it to the senior without trying anything on your own. That makes you look incompetent. So the book suggests that you tell the rest of the story. Instead of saying I didn't try anything, tell a story where you tried some things. Obviously, that needs to be true. So you might need to actually go do some actions in addition to telling a slightly different story. You may need to take some actions before your crucial conversation takes place. Turn villains into humans. This breeds positive shared intent. Consider the case where you're applying to the new employer. You're going to be showing a positive signal when you talk well about your previous employer. The company was great. I learned so much. Unfortunately, they didn't need an engineer at the level above me. There just wasn't a business need for that. So that's why I'm looking elsewhere. Or unfortunately, they don't have this tech stack I'm interested in. So they're subject to some constraints, and that's why I'm looking out. But it was a great experience there. I'm better for being there. Definitely don't say like I'm a worse engineer now. That doesn't look well for you, does it? There's also this saying that we never attribute to malice that which is explained by incompetence. And I think this holds up well here as well. Maybe your previous employer or Jim made some mistakes. Maybe there's just a lack of training opportunities at that company. It's better to say that than to say that they were just bad people. And I like this hostage negotiation mental model. So say that you have a Jim. Jim is a truly bad dude doing bad things, whether by incompetence or malice. You can choose to be the victim or you can choose to be the hostage negotiator. So put yourself in the position of having a crucial conversation and being a negotiator. That was the end of chapter 5. Get ready for chapter 6, which is going to kick off part 2. Follow for more.